Welcome, listeners, to another exciting episode of Rockstar Parents and Teens. Today's topic is a really important one for all the parents, including myself. And today we are going to talk about how to talk honestly with your kids about drug use, theirs and yours. And in my workshops with parents, pretty much all the parents come up with this concern, the same topic. How do you talk to your kids about the drug use? And it's going to be, I'm really excited for this. It's going to be a really cool interview. And to help me out today in this conversation, I have Jonathan Thompson with me from all the way from Michigan. So, welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being invited.
Awesome, cool. Well, before we get into this conversation, I would like to say a few words about Jonathan. Jonathan is the founder of psychedelicparenting.org, a resource for building community and family traditions around traditional plant sacraments in the global north. He is also the father of three, committed husband, and Sunlight's as officer manager for a well-established holistic health practice in mid-Michigan, USA. He has a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from Michigan State University and has spent the last 10 years in management and human resources in the retail and healthcare industries. Jonathan is also very interested in developing fact-based drug education programs and educational materials for youth as an antidote to the just say no approach that has led to confusion and misinformation about substances among our teens and tweens. So, without any further delay, Jonathan, welcome again to the show, and let's start the conversation.
Okay.
So, first of all, before we get into these tough questions of how do we talk to our kids about drugs, I would like to know, and if you don't mind sharing with the audience, how you became an expert in this field. What led you? What is your past? Is there something stemming from your childhood which
hmm
made you interested in this field, or is there something else you want to share?
Sure. So I think maybe expert is a little more of a title than I'm maybe comfortable with. I think that I'm sort of a well-informed armchair enthusiast, I guess you could
Okay,
say.
I like
Uh,
that.
um, so yeah, I got started pretty early, I think, personally, being sort of curious about drugs. I started smoking cannabis when I was in seventh grade, um, and my I've always been a very spiritually focused person from as long as I can remember, and from the very beginning of my experimentation with different substances and stuff, I always sort of approached it from a spiritually minded perspective. But a lot of my peers did not do that. And one of the things that I'm a child of the 80s and grew up in the era of DARE education in the United States. I'm not sure if you guys have that in Canada or not, but it's this program that was set up in the United States that essentially sends police officers into elementary and middle schools, and the police officer comes and says, drugs are bad, don't do drugs. If you do drugs, you're going to go to jail and you're going to become an addict and you're going to have a horrible life.
Hmm.
And myself and many of my peers those saw through that facade pretty quickly. And they talk about cannabis being the quote unquote gateway drug. And while the evidence does not show that it directly leads to consuming so-called other harder substances, one of the things that it did do for myself and does continue to do for many young people is it is the gateway drug to sort of like breaking trust, I guess you could say, in in this system of, you have this police officer coming into your school and telling you that all these things, and this is factual. They're presenting it as factual anyway. And then the first time you smoke a little bit of cannabis and you feel good about it, and you don't turn into a hardened drug addict the next month, suddenly you think, well, what are these other things that they were telling me are bad, and maybe they weren't being very factual or honest about those things, and then I'm going to try all these other things. And so, I don't think that cannabis is really the gateway drug in terms of addiction, but it does open a door to questioning the programming or the programs that are presented to kids in schools. And so I see that as kind of a first step. I mean, in North America now, we've really softened our attitudes really considerably about cannabis specifically, and so we have this opportunity to kind of start from scratch and say, let's start to give our children honest conversations about what these substances are and how they can make good choices, as opposed to just telling them, we're not going to give you information except that you should say no to these things.
Interesting. So how? So what got you interested at I guess you were 12, 13, something like that?
Yeah.
So was it for recreation, or was it a peer pressure? You gave in to other kids around you, or was it to forget something, some wounds?
I would say that it was just curiosity more than anything. I had a friend whose father was like a clandestine cannabis grower, and I was at their house, and I had very little, I hadn't had any exposure to any serious drugs or anything. My parents weren't even really very committed drinkers, and but we were at his house around harvest time, and there was just like, garbage bags full of cannabis in his basement, and he's like, oh, you want to try this? My dad won't even notice. And so that was the introduction, I guess. And, it wasn't like I tried it the first time and suddenly I was doing it all the time or anything close to that. But, by the time I got to be in college, cannabis was a pretty active part of my life. I actually started out in university going to culinary school, and I don't know if any of your listeners are aware of the environment of most sort of commercial kitchens, but there's a lot of substance use and abuse that occurs in restaurant situations. So I went from being this small town kid who had only smoked a little bit of cannabis to going to culinary school and being exposed to like everything that was out there. And I didn't really feel like I had a lot of good tools because I recognized that there was a lot of things that I said, oh, I'm never going to do these things. And as soon as somebody said, hey, you want to try this? I was like, hey, sure, why not?
So Jonathan, while you are still in your past, let me ask you this. So, well, I guess your parents found out somehow. Maybe you told them or from your peers.
Mm-hmm.
So how was their reaction? Like, how did it went down in your household?
Well, I don't think that I really was very open with my parents about my cannabis and psychedelics use as a college student. It wasn't something that my parents did. I don't think they really knew that I had tried cannabis when I was in high school. I didn't do it at my parents' house, and I wasn't buying it or anything like that very often. I think they did discover a couple of sort of drinking parties that I had when they were gone for the weekend or something like that. But it was always sort of approached of, you're an intelligent person, and please make sound choices and don't drive anywhere under the influence. And my parents took a really soft hand with me and just gave me the space to be the person that I was, and they trusted that I was an intelligent human being, that they had given me the right tools to make good decisions. And occasionally I made bad decisions like any teenager does, but they never really sort of came down really hard on me about stuff. They gave me the space to recognize, you recognize you made a bad decision, and your recognition of that is sort of sufficient punishment. So
okay, so let me ask you this before we go any further. So they had a softer hand. So now imagine if they had a harder hand, if they were really being hard on you in those days, What do you see? What could have happened in your personality, or what could have you done?
Well, I think that being just sort of an inherently questioning human being, I think if someone had been really hard on me or tried to sort of push more of the sort of doctrine or dogma of the just say no era, that could very easily see through. I think if my parents had been really strict about that, I probably just would have pushed harder in the other direction. I think I probably would have just tried more things because I recognized that I wasn't being given truth about these small things, and I think the fact that they did give me the space to be myself and to make my own choices kind of prevented me from being a really really serious rebel, I guess you could say. I was sort of an intellectual rebel as opposed to I wasn't running off and doing things that were going to get me thrown in jail. I was usually pretty careful with the things that I did, and and also recognizing the fact that I was raised in a rural, fairly homogenous white community did not expose me to a lot of the sort of injustices that we see in like urban policing and things like that, where people of color are much more regularly arrested for minor drug possessions and things like that. So, I constantly recognize how blessed I was to be born where I was, and I mourn and constantly and try to do the best I can to speak up for those injustices. That's kind of an aside, but it's definitely something that I think that I now, as an adult, think about and recognize that I was lucky to be in that situation.
Well, you brought up a very cool point, and I would like to share that here. Contrary to what general parents think, the idea that being hard and being or giving punishments to their kids because of their drug use, I think it's better to be a little bit of liberal and let kids make the decision about the use or their choices instead of being, hard and angry and frustrated and putting curfews down and all those kind of things. I don't think that works in the longer run.
Right, right, I agree. And
Go ahead.
so I was going to say a little bit more about my background.
Yep.
So when I was an undergraduate, I discovered a lot of the writings of Terence McKenna, who is kind of called if your listeners don't know who he is, he was sort of thought of as like the Timothy Leary of the 1990s. He advocated and talked a lot about using psychedelic mushrooms for sort of personal exploration and spiritual development. And so I became kind of a devotee of that path, if you will, and did a lot of personal exploration and had a lot of experiences that profoundly changed my worldview. And then I took about a decade where I didn't do any substances. I spent a lot of time my wife and I, after I graduated from college, moved to Northern California and lived in a cooperative community dedicated to yoga meditation. And so we lived there for a number of years and lived pretty clean lives. And then in 2012, I had the opportunity to go to a conference that was dedicated to the academic study of psychedelic medicines, and it kind of reopened all my interest in this stuff. And since then, I've had a few opportunities to sort of revisit those kinds of experiences, and I found that in my adulthood, the experiences are profoundly different than they were when I was a kid, when I was a college student. And I've talked to other people who've had these same kinds of experiences, and I think that maybe it has something to do with like the way our brains work as adults versus when you're in your late teens or early 20s and your brain is still developing and changing. And when I was in my 20s, my psychedelic experiences were very visual, lots of very strange stories I could tell about re-experiencing my own birth or traveling to the outer ends of the universe or meeting strange aliens and weird stories that people tell. But as an adult, my experiences were different. They were they lacked the sort of really intense visual experience, and it was all like contemplative and relational. So I would one particular experience that I had. I At the time I was managing a retail pharmacy, and I had this experience where I re-experienced an interaction that I'd had with an employee where I was coaching them on some mistakes they had made, and instead of being me talking to them, I sort of was like inside of their head and listening to me talk and feeling their emotions of how I was speaking to that person. And it just gave me all this insight about how I can be a gentler, kinder leader. And then that sort of extends into your family life, and how do you be a gentler and kinder father, and how do you be a more giving and loving husband, and how do you be a more dutiful and more respectful son. And so all this stuff sort of just started churning up in my life about how can I really start to live out in my family relationships and in my work relationships the values that I've always had because of having these experiences, and which are now being more deeply emphasized. And so I started just kind of writing this personal blog about how my experiences with these medicines had enhanced my family life. And it sort of blossomed, and what started out as just kind of like, live journal-esque personal blog, now has we have a few collaborators. My wife writes this really funny little comic for it called Is This Your Normal? We also have a podcast, which is I'm releasing the 6th episode of the podcast on Monday. And the podcast, I interview people, a mixture of interviewing what you would say like celebrities in the psychedelic movement who have had children, and talk to them about their experiences raising their kids. I also talk to sort of quote unquote regular people, and I speak to them, and they speak under a pseudonym, and we talk about their own profound experiences of healing in their families related to these medicines. And then and also something I've been starting that I haven't put out a podcast on this yet, but is interviewing the adult children of like psychedelic celebrities, talking about, they get that other side of the perspective of like, what was it like to be raised by this person, and what kind of mistakes did they make that you want to talk about, and what kind of insights can you give to people raising their kids now under the values of these experiences and these medicines. And I just want to, our goal is to create a resource and where people can come and get information and bounce ideas off one another. We're currently developing a forum space so that we can kind of expand the conversation more widely to more people. And we have a pretty active Facebook page. So we're just trying to open up the conversation and get people involved. I also... Oh, go ahead.
No, this is very cool. I mean, thank you for sharing your past and what you're doing now and why
Sure.
you're doing it now. And I just realized that I'm not the only crazy person out there. You're probably the second one. And the reason I say that is when you were talking about this experience, this psychedelic experience of seeing yourself in one of your employees' brain and looking at yourself through their eyes. So it reminded me of something I experienced in one of my shamanic journeys. I have 2 daughters. So I was able to go actually in their bodies, or let's say in their brains, and look at myself as Faisal the father through their eyes. And I was looking from their eyes what kind of expectations they have from their father, and what are they missing, what are the things they haven't told me yet. So it was just like crazy, and now I can totally relate to what you were saying. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, like what it can do for you as a family, as a parent, or as a kid, and how it can create these awesome bonds and relationships between these families.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's get back to how parents can become honest with their children about their own past drug use or experimentations without confusing their kids about the dangers of drug use.
Great. So my opinion in this, and I've talked to both parents, and I have done a few different speaking engagements and at conferences, which are often at universities. So I've got like undergraduates who are listening to me talk about being a parent, and here's how you be a parent. And then they come up to me and they say, well, I don't have any kids, but I'd really like to get your opinion on how do I talk to my mom and dad about my own use. So that we've sort of spent time focusing on both sides of that. And I think that the really important thing here is to approach all these conversations from a place of honesty. So we have a list on our website of what we call the 5 psychedelic family values, and one of the ones that I spend the most time talking about is what we call radical honesty. And so when it comes to talking with your kids about your own past and about maybe their present, is that you approach it from a place of honesty, and you don't want to say, well, I did this, but it's bad, and I'm lucky that I'm not dead, and so you should never do it. I think that what you should do is say, I smoked cannabis when I was in high school, and I found that it was really fun. But I also recognize that there's lots of studies out there that show that it may or may not be the best thing for a developing brain, and but you're going to make your own choices, and I want to get as much solid information in front of you that you're capable of understanding as possible, and give you the tools to make the best choices. So I see it as being very similar to the way that we approach like sex education, and so not counting like places where they only teach like abstinence education, but where you go to a sort of regular school, and then they say, this is the vagina, and this is the fallopian tubes, and this is how everything works, and this is how you use a condom, and all that kind of stuff. I think that honest conversations with your kids about drug use should be very similar. So, this is cannabis, and this is the effects that it has on your body and your brain, and this is methamphetamines, and these are the effects that it has on your body and your brain, and these are very different things, and they can have very different effects, and they have very different like levels of potential for addiction, and this is what people look like when they've been using methamphetamines for 2 years and they've aged 50 years, and these are the potential possibilities that you can get into. And let's talk about what the real ramifications are here, and help you make honest decisions in your life. So that's how I see like having those honest conversations with your kids. Don't worry about that. If I tell my kid I smoked weed when I was a kid, that's going to make them do it. I don't think that's the case. I think they want honesty from you. And
well, wait a minute, Jonathan. I can already hear these people on the phone lines, and they're imaginary people, and these are parents, and they're saying, "Oh, what are you talking about, Jonathan? You're telling me to tell my kids what I did in the past. By doing that, I'm going to look dumb and stupid, and my kids, they're going to stop trusting me, and they will probably start using more cannabis or other drugs."
I would say that one of the things that our parents' generation had, in some ways they're lucky that we do not have the benefit of, is that our kids are very digitally connected. So any sort of false information or clouded information that we give them, they're going to probably be able to discredit that pretty quickly. And so I think because of social media and because of the internet, it makes so much more sense from my perspective to just be honest. There's a very well-known visionary artist, Alex Gray. Him and his wife Allison, in the sort of early aughts, like 2007, 2008, did a number of different speaking engagements where their daughter Zena had just turned 18, and they had brought her on stage with them, and they did some sort of roundtable discussions about parenting. And that was one of the big inspirations for us when we started our website. And one of the things that Allison really emphasized in these conversations was that you should be honest with your kids. So when your kids ask you questions, you should answer them honestly, but not give them more information than they're ready to receive. And the way that you gauge whether they're ready to receive the next piece of information is by letting them lead the conversation. So if they come to you and they say, "Hey, Mom, we had this conversation. A police officer came into a school and talked to us about, how bad drugs were, and do you know anything about drugs? And you say, yes, I do know some things about drugs. And well, do you have any experience? Did you ever use anything? Yes, I'd used some things, and I tried cannabis a few times, or, I had a serious alcohol problem when I was a certain age or whatever. I think that, and including sort of everything together, I think that one of the things we do in sort of the global north is that we separate alcohol and cigarettes from cannabis and psychedelics and other things. And so it creates this dichotomy of like, so these things over here that are illegal, those are the drugs. And these things over here, alcohol and cigarettes, those are the, that's what you do on the weekend to relax or kick back or whatever. They're not drugs. But those things really are all drugs. And so I try to approach them when I'm talking to my own kids who are young, but so we don't get into really deep stuff yet. But we talk about it in terms of it all comes together, it all goes together. And, and so, like nicotine and alcohol are far more addictive than many of the things that we consider to be the sort of bad drugs on the other side.
Well, there are people who drink 5 or 6 cups of caffeine, every day.
Sure.
And then they put tons of sugar in it. So for me, I mean, holy crap, that is a drug. Those are two drugs right there. And people think if I'm drinking coffee and chugging down this sugar plus eating sweets, I am cleaner than the people who are not using these things but are using some psychedelic drugs.
Right. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. Those are all mind-altering substances. Yeah.
Exactly. And for me, caffeine, that much use of caffeine plus the sugar is even worse than the other safer or natural drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Yeah, and the process of extracting crystalline sugar from sugar cane or sugar beets is not terribly different than the process of extracting cocaine from coca leaves. So, from a chemical perspective, the processes aren't really that dissimilar.
So now while we are on this subject, and the parents are listening right now, they're all tuned in now because it's getting interesting. What is the difference between a man-made drug and, let's say, a naturally occurring or a natural plant drug? Or no, not drug, I won't call it a drug, but
Sure.
Well, people call it a drug, so let's call it a drug.
Sure. So I would say that, well, first of all, I have a mentor, a friend named Dennis McKenna, who is he says, from his perspective, he says, it's all drugs. Our brain is made of drugs, and so there's really no distinction to some degree. But I think that one of the distinctions that can be made is from a perspective of like intensity and concentration. So if you, for example, in the Amazon, people will chew coca leaves on a regular basis or drink coca tea as a sort of pick me up in the morning. One of the things that chewing coca leaves is used to help people function better in like higher altitude, lower oxygen environments.
Right.
So it gives them more energy when they're not breathing as much oxygen in the mountains and stuff like that and doing hard work. And drinking coca tea in the morning is kind of the same way that we drink coffee in the morning. So that's a consumption of a natural plant. When you look at snorting cocaine or smoking crack, it's the same chemical, but you've concentrated it, you've intensified the experience, and you've intensified how the body reacts to that.
So it's like Red Bull having copious amounts of sugar in it, that kind of thing. Like now you're taking cocaine, which has been altered from what it was actually in nature.
Right.
And now you're taking like 1,000 times more or whatever, putting it in the body.
Exactly. So it's much more difficult to get, a sort of an overdose level of cocaine from chewing coca leaves than it is from, smoking crack. So the concentration is much higher. So that's part of it. And there's that sort of that extraction process. Also, when you're consuming a natural plant, it's pretty easy if you know how to recognize the plant to know what you have. Whereas, if you have a mystery white powder, it may be cocaine, it may be heroin, it may be something else you don't know. I mean, there's one of the things that's happened in the United States in the last couple of years is that people who sell heroin have been substituting fentanyl for heroin. Fentanyl is a prescription narcotic that is much more concentrated and powerful than heroin is,
Wow.
and so people they'll overdose and die because they're they know how to dose heroin. They're dosing it thinking it's heroin, and it turns out it's fentanyl, and they die.
Wow.
And so you never know really when you just have some powder in front of you, unless you're a chemist and you have some kind of testing equipment, you can't guarantee what that stuff is. And whereas with a plant, if you have a fairly decent sense of identifying plants, you get comfortable with them, you can look at that and say, yes, I know what that is. And even if I don't necessarily know exactly what it is, it's most of the time it's pretty difficult to die from, consuming plant material. You may get sick, but you're not going to die.
So wait a minute, Jonathan. I think I heard somebody else now. There's another parent. They're saying, I don't care, synthetic or natural, these are all drugs, and they will always stay in your body, and they'll mess up your brain and your stomach and whatever, So what do you tell them?
Well, I would say that we, in sort of North American, European descendant culture, actually have a very unique and dysfunctional relationship to the natural plant world. When you look at the history, when the entirety of human history and human civilizations, so many of these things that we consider drugs or bad things, hallucinogenic substances, there are many traditional cultures that have thousands of years of history of use in these things. Even cannabis, for example, we call it sort of colloquially weed in the West, but cannabis has any plants, any cultivated plants on Earth, non-food cultivated plants, cannabis has had the longest relationship with the human race, documentable, of any plant that other than food plants. So we call it a weed, saying it's something you should pull out and throw away, but it's been with us, cultivated by humans for nearly the entirety of recorded history. So it's pretty interesting when you look at it that way, and it's a very, very safe plant. In order to die, for example, to overdose on THC by using cannabis, you would have to eat like 5 pounds of cannabis. So very, very difficult to die.
But does it mess up your brain?
Does it mess up your brain? Well, there are some studies that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years. There's one specific study that came out a few years ago that said that it may have negative effects on sort of like early use in teens, for example. But in terms of like how do these things affect adults? THC there are many studies that have come out that show that THC can reduce or kill cancer cells, and many people are seeing really miraculous healings from there's another substance that's in cannabis called CBD that is non-psychoactive, that has really powerful healing qualities for people that have seizures and pain relief, for people that have chronic pain disorders. So it can be delivered as an oil under the tongue, it can be vaporized in an e-cigarette form, and people who have chronic pain, who have seizures, can get relief without even necessarily needing to, get high. So, and one of I have a number of friends who work for Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and they've been doing long, extensive studies on psilocybin, which is the active psychedelic ingredient, if you will, in magic mushrooms. And they're finding that this substance has neuroregenerative properties. So it actually builds new neural connections in the brain. It's been shown to help people with addiction. So they're currently in the middle of doing a study showing how psilocybin treatment can help people quit smoking, can help them give up serious alcohol addictions. So we're talking about plants that have potentially thousands of years of documented history, which means that we can be assured that they're relatively safe.
So is this the reason that's why they are being banned by the authorities? We might be able to expand our, knowledge about the universe and expand our brain power?
I think it's an interesting question, and it's complex. And I personally try not to delve too much into the sort of conspiracy theory side of it, but I do think that one of the things about these substances is that they make people question dogma or question sort of socially constructed realities, and they make people like think about things in profoundly different ways than they're used to. So that's something that's really hard for our sort of hierarchical, patriarchal, dogmatic system to really be okay with. And I think that a lot of the problem has to do with the way that these substances were sort of thrown on the world in the mid 1960s and in early 1970s. They were thrown out there without a lot of. There was not really any sort of what we like to say like social container to hold these experiences for people and give them the space to understand what they're going through and how to process it well. And that's, I think, one of the things that I kind of see that we're in a renaissance today with how to deal with these medicines. And one of the things that we're doing much, much better than we did back then is that we have, first of all, we have an entire generation of people that had strong experiences and can lend their sort of wisdom to us now. So, in these ancient societies, indigenous societies where people had thousands of years of use, you have an experience and the society already has a container for how to process that, how to help you move through it into the next phase of your life. We didn't have that, and that was a lot of the chaos that ensued in the 1960s. It was, turn on, tune in, drop out, and reject society, and people, like crazy things happen in wild parties, and where very bizarre things occurred, and some people got hurt, and society did not know what to do with that. It was just chaos. So now we have better containers. We have people that have had experiences, and they can give back to the next generation and say, here's better ways of doing that. People are writing books. Jim Fadiman wrote this really great book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide that gives you, this is how you help somebody have this experience. And Annie Oak, who founded the Full Circle Tea House, which is a place where people can go at Burning Man to, if they're having really difficult psychedelic experiences, to have somebody there who can help coach them through it. She also wrote a book on how to help people, how to coach people through difficult psychedelic experiences. So we have containers now. We're starting to build a culture around this, and we're teaching people what's the best way to do these things in a way that you'll get the most benefit out of and have the least chance of having a really negative experience.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So now, I have a 13-year-old daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say I don't know anything about the drugs. I haven't done drugs or
Mm-hmm.
haven't experienced. The only thing I know is drugs are bad, weed is bad, cannabis is bad, LSD and all those things are crap.
Mm-hmm.
So she comes home and I smell some funny smell coming out of her,
Mm-hmm.
It could be weed. So what do I do as a parent? I'm panicking right now.
Sure. I think that the first thing that we need to do is step back and say, what kind of relationship do we already have with our children? Do we have a trusting relationship? Have we given them the tools to make good decisions in the past? And then educate ourselves. So one website that I recommend to people wholeheartedly all the time is Erowid.org. I'm sorry, Erowid.org. So it's EROWID.org. And it's a huge resource on, what are you can search for any plant, any chemical substance. It's encyclopedic on human beings' relationships with drugs and plants. And you can look for a plant that you think, well, I think my child might be, using ecstasy, Molly, MDMA, whatever the term you use. I think they might be smoking marijuana. I can look and they will list what are the laws pertaining to these substances, what are the effects of these substances, what do these substances look like? So there'll be pictures of the substance, so that if you see a pill in your kid's purse or backpack or whatever, maybe you can look it up and see what it might be if you suspect. So it's a really great resource of knowledge and information that's presented in a very straightforward, non-judgmental way. And I recommend that to people that are already interested in these things and people that aren't, because it's very accessible. It does have a lot of what you call trip reports, where people like describe their own experiences on these substances, which can be useful for somebody who's like, well, should I take this or should I not take this? It may come off as difficult to handle for somebody that is just looking, say, scared about their kid and don't know what's going on. I would say for that person, just disregard these trip reports, because it's an N of one, is what we say. It's not scientific information. It's just one person saying, I did this thing, and you can't really verify if they're really on that actual thing. You can't verify if they've had other substances in the mix. But the information on laws and the chemistry and in pictures, it's just an amazing resource. And I think everybody who has a kid that may be having a relationship with substances, this should be their first place to go, because it's honest information. And one thing is that a lot of people's fears are based on false information, or information that they got when they were a kid and they were in the DARE program, and I was told that all these things are terrible and LSD creates holes in your brain and all these kind of crazy things that aren't true. And when you start to actually get real information, you say, well, maybe I don't really want my kid smoking cannabis, but if I can read these things first and sort of calm down and realize that it's not as bad as I think it is, then you can approach it from an honest place with your kid and say, hey, I found this in your bag and I'd like to have a conversation with you about it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we also overlook as parents that what else they're doing. Like, they're eating pizzas every day, hot dogs, and munching down on candies all day long.
Yeah.
So
right.
I think those things are worse than having your kid having a little bit of experience in these safer, I would say, safer category drugs.
Sure. And the other thing is that the substances that are legal in our society, the legal drugs, alcohol, for example, are actually, in terms of how likely it is for a person to die from an overdose and the long-term negative health ramifications, the negative long-term health ramifications of alcohol and the chance of the possibility of dying from an alcohol overdose are vastly more than like cannabis or psychedelics. I mean, LSD is from an ability to kill you perspective is like the safest substance known to humanity. So it has the LD50, which is the likelihood of dying from consumption. How much you have to. It's a ratio of the amount that's psychoactive versus the amount that you will die from. It's like unknown. It's so large, and that we hear stories all the time of freshmen in college dying from alcohol overdose because they went on their 21st birthday and drank 21 shots and they hadn't eaten anything all day and they die. And I drive part-time for Uber and I'm in a college town, and so I get to kind of see the worst of the sort of this relationship that we as a society have with alcohol. And it makes me really sad. I mean, I feel bad for people, and I wish that I had more opportunity to kind of steer them, but it's not really my place. I'm just driving them home.
I know. So now, I know you had this podcast, and you have interviewed some, what do you call, psychedelic parents. So is there any one specific short story or a lesson or an insight you want to share?
Yeah. So there was an interesting story that a gentleman who I call Mike in the podcast shared this story about coming out to his kids regarding his own experiences with the Amazonian medicine ayahuasca, and he had just come back from he had gone down to Peru for a 10-day experience there, and he came back and his kids were like, well, what were you doing down there? And he said, and him and I had talked a couple of times, and I'd had these conversations about honesty, and he said, I really reflected on what you had said about being honest with your kids, and I just felt like I'm just going to tell them. And so he started talking about his own experiences, and his kids are all kind of in their like teens and early 20s, and they started asking him a lot of questions like, is this safe, and what does it mean to be a drug, and why are some drugs acceptable in society and others are not? And he said it was a really great, like, honest and like being human beings together and breaking down this idea of like, I'm the parent with all the knowledge and you're the kid that I'm going to give knowledge to, but they sort of met in this place in the middle where they were having a real serious adult conversation together. And then he said he walked away from the conversation feeling really good, and all of a sudden it just like snapped in his brain, and he said, "Oh, I should, I just had this conversation. I should probably tell their mom about this," because at the time, he had been divorced for about 2 years, and so he called up his ex-wife and said, "I just want to let you know I just had this conversation," and she was very, very upset. Kind of, they're gonna make them think this stuff is okay. They're gonna do all these drugs, and they just had this really. They came to this place of honesty, and he said he recognized from what she was saying that he had maybe been a little bit overzealous about some of the ways that he had the conversation. And the interesting thing was, like, they continued this dialogue, and then it came around about a year later. And what came out of this dialogue is that the two of them went to an ayahuasca ceremony together.
Holy.
He drank, the divorced people drinking ayahuasca together had this profound experience of healing where they were able to just let go of their baggage and forgive each other. And then he sort of engineered this little event. And so he had two of the kids and she had the other, and they live in the Chicago area, and they were flying, she was flying back into Chicago, and he offered, and with one of their kids, and he offered to pick her up at the airport. And they stopped, he picked them up, and as they were driving away, he sort of pulled off on the side of the highway, and him and his ex-wife are sitting in the front seat, and the kids are in the back seat. And he said that he just told her that he loved and respected her as a human, and he wanted her to be as happy as she possibly could be, and that he wanted to empower her happiness, and that he released her with joy, and that he was so in love with the family that they had created together. And everyone in the car is just bawling. And it was just this amazing experience of something that can be really divisive and devastating to kids when their parents divorce, kind of became this, like, I can see that, while they weren't able to work it out, they can be civilized human beings and be friends and together. And he said it was just an amazing experience.
No, I know it was, and thank you for sharing. Medicine works in mysterious ways.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I believe. Now, real quick, we don't have enough time here, but let's touch on this subject too. There are different drug education programs and like authorities. They try to do their best to implement these laws and all that kind of stuff. So why do you think the drug education programs of the past have failed to curtail drug use and abuse among our younger generation?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I think that kids are smart, especially teenagers, and they're getting smarter. They have access to so much information, and you can't really pull the wool over their eyes. You couldn't when I was a kid. You couldn't pull the wool over my eyes, and it's more so now than it was then. And so the reason that they fail is because they don't offer kids a real, they don't treat them like intelligent people, and they don't offer them honest information. And so I have a vision for what drug education is going to look like in the future, and I have some interesting partners that are working on it, and hopefully in the next few years we'll be able to have some tools that we can present to schools and to educators to change the way that we talk to kids about drugs. And so the reason it hasn't worked is because we're not honest. And when we're honest and we say, this is what this substance will do to you, versus this is what this substance will do to you, and these are the ramifications of using that substance. Now, I'm going to sort of leave it to you to make intelligent choices, recognizing that all of these substances are illegal under the current drug law, and there's those ramifications as well. And also, so separating the sort of negative ramifications of the law versus the negative ramifications of the drugs, I think, is a very important thing too. So it's not that going to jail because you smoked cannabis is invalid, which, well, I mean, I think that probably we shouldn't send people to jail for smoking cannabis, but that it's something that happens. So being honest with them and saying, this is a potential ramification, but it's not the same thing as the health risks of using cannabis. So, you're not going to go to jail if you drink alcohol, but it could potentially be worse for your body. So those are the things that you should consider, and don't necessarily think of the law as being the guiding principle for why or why not these things should or should not be consumed.
So now, for those who are kind of interested in these experiences, psychedelic experiences, or some call them trips, From looking at them from a spiritual point of view, what are these trips when somebody's explaining, I took this specific plant
Hmm.
and I was on a trip, I was seeing these things and I was flying and I was doing this, blah blah blah. So what is that? What is that experience? Is this just crap, or is it real, or what is it in your opinion?
Well, I, 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 I don't know if I've made a definite decision about what these experiences are exactly. I've had these experiences, and what I find is whether I don't know if it's purely a chemical reaction in my brain or if I'm connecting with some higher authority. But what it does is that they dissolve boundaries, and they can reduce the effect of the ego on our decision making and our thought processes. So it's in some ways the big thing that they do. They're sort of like uh, anesthesia for the ego. They sort of tamp down that sort of part of your brain that's saying I, me, I need this, I am a person and who is separate from the world, and it does sort of lets that part of your brain fall asleep in some sense, and then you can be connected in this really amazing way to like the other people around you and the physical world, and maybe the higher spiritual world as well. So it's what's happening is that it's dissolving boundaries, reducing the power of the ego over your thoughts and your heart and your mind, and that can be a really amazing experience when it's done in the right setting and setting and container. It can also be a real scary experience if you haven't been prepared for this. I mean, in some ways, losing the ego can feel like death. And sometimes when people say they had like a bad trip, which people do have bad trips, but a bad trip, from my perspective, is an experience that someone either wasn't prepared for, or they weren't willing to sort of accept and willing and ride through. So I had an experience a little over a year ago with ayahuasca that could have very well been considered a bad trip. It was literally the most challenging 3 hours of my entire life, where I was in a really dark place. I couldn't really move. I was like kind of paralyzed, and my mind, I couldn't even sort of gather my one or two thoughts together. Everything was racing. I didn't have a sense of personal identity. I was panicking. But I was with someone, uh, a experienced facilitator in this medicine, who was holding my hand through the whole experience and just kept reassuring me, it's going to be okay in a few hours. This experience will subside. You'll go back to being who you are. And the next morning when I woke up, I felt like I had been resurrected, that I had died and come back to life. And I walked away from that experience. I had an 8-year serious alcohol addiction for 8 years, and I walked away from that experience with absolutely no cravings. Like the cravings just died.
Wow.
And a few times after that, I was able to drink alcohol, have like, one drink at a party and not feel like I needed to get drunk, like, normal, quote unquote, normal people drink alcohol. Since then, I've given up drinking completely, just because I feel like it dampens my thought processes and makes me not less alert. But I don't feel like I'm an alcoholic anymore. I feel like I'm cured. And that's a pretty miraculous thing in our society, which, most of the sort of 12 steps and stuff say you should label yourself as an alcoholic for your whole life. And I feel like it was almost a miraculous healing. But that could have been a terrible experience where, like, I was panicking, I was paralyzed. If I hadn't been someone that knew what they were doing in that experience, I could have ended up in the hospital, getting a shot of Thorazine, being strapped down, whatever horrible things might have happened. But because I was with someone that knew what was going on and knew how to help contain the experience for me, a bad trip became a challenging, transformative experience.
Well, I totally agree with what you just said earlier. What I believe is my personal opinion is just like you said. During this kind of experience, egos is put down to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And what I also believe is not only we have higher self and other entities out there, but also we have all the answers
Mm-hmm.
inside of us. So once that ego is on the side, kind of sleeping, we start finding all these answers, all these mechanisms are already there, and it starts giving us these cool ideas about our relationships and all that.
Yes.
But in our this society, our ego takes over, in normal
Yes.
day-to-day life.
Yes.
So that is pretty cool. And you were talking about ayahuasca.
Hmm.
So really quick, if people don't know, or people who don't know about ayahuasca, what is that? Real quick, 30
Okay,
seconds.
so ayahuasca is a combination of two different plants from the Amazon jungle. One contains a substance which actually naturally occurs in the brain called dimethyltryptamine. The other one contains something called harmaline. The dimethyltryptamine is normally not active orally, so if you were to just eat the plant, you wouldn't have the experience. But the other plant, the ayahuasca vine, contains this stuff called harmaline, which is an MAO inhibitor. So it neutralizes enzymes in your stomach that would normally break down the DMT and makes the DMT orally active. So the two plants together, while not psychoactive in and of themselves, become a psychoactive substance when combined together. It has a potentially, some people say maybe 5,000-year history of use in the Amazon jungle, and it is become something that has a very high interest in society right now. I mean, there's many people that are experimenting with this substance, and there's a number of churches in the United States and in Canada that use this as a sacrament. One that has a pretty big foothold in the Pacific Northwest is called the Santo Daime. So they have a church in Vancouver. They have one in Portland. They have one in Seattle. They have one in Ashland, Oregon. And they have a really interesting container for if it's something that people are curious about. I would recommend that would be a good place to seek it out because they're doing these experiences in a legal setting, so they have legal protection under religious freedom. And some of the churches are pretty welcoming and open to people coming in and just trying it out.
So now towards the end, what would you like to say to parents who have teens out there, they're dealing with younger generation, and there's a possibility that their teen, they might try some kind of form of a plant medicine or drug. So what would you say to those parents? What should they do?
Well, the first thing they should do is make sure they know their child. So build a relationship with this person. Like we have to figure out where's that boundary when they go from kind of thinking of themselves as a kid to thinking of themselves as an adult that can make their own decisions. Because I think a lot of the rebellion that we experience in our society around teenage years is a sort of a kid that the kid wants to be thought of as an adult, but the parents don't want to think of them as an adult. And we lack in our society a real powerful right what I call or what's called rites of passage. And it's something else that we work on at Psychedelic Parenting is how do we engineer these rites of passage where a person can be formally recognized in the society as like having come of age and should be treated more like an adult, because I think that's all really cloudy. And I think working with your kid to say, well, where are you and how do you think of yourself? That's the most important part of this, is being honest and having a good relationship. Second is having the right information. So you need to go out there and go to places like earwood.org and find out about the substance that you think your kid might be taking, and know what it is and know what the risks are before you go in there and have that conversation. Because if you're going in from a place of calm with knowledge that you can actually have a conversation with them about what these things do, then you're going to be in a better place.
Okay, awesome. Now we only have about a minute, so please tell our parents or listeners who might have some questions, who want to connect with you, maybe want to check out your programs you offer for teens and adults. So please share your email or web address or anything else you have.
So our website is at psychedelicparenting.org. We also have a Facebook page. We have a regular podcast, which is published on Podomatic at psychedelicparenting.podomatic.org, and it's just recently been listed on iTunes, so you can also find us there. And I'm also going to be speaking next weekend at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver, and you can get tickets for that at spiritplantmedicine.com.
And what is the date? Which date exactly are you speaking?
It's next week, Saturday and Sunday. So that would be the 25th and 26th, or 24th and 25th of October at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for coming on the show and sharing your experience, your knowledge, your expertise on this very hot topic for parents. And I really appreciate you coming on the show again.
I really appreciate you inviting me. It's great. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it, my listeners. That's the end of today's show. Till next week, if you have any questions you want to ask, you can email me at faisal@theleadersmith.com. Till next week, be a rockstar parent and create some rockstar teens. Thank you. Bye-bye.